So, like the way that I've been addressing this or why I chose water is because it's an undeniable issue. Like there is only so much of it on the planet. Societies do not exist without it.
Hello, and welcome to Environment Variables, brought to you by the Green Software Foundation. In each episode, we discuss the latest news and events surrounding green software. On our show, you can expect candid conversations with top experts in their field who have a passion for how to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of software.
Welcome to Environment Variables and the Week in Green Software, our regular news review podcast where we break down the story of shaping sustainable software and greener computing. I'm one of your hosts, Tzviya and Kate, joined by our other regular host, Kate Goldenring, as well as our guest, Masheika Allgood. Masheika is an AI ethicist and founder of AllAI Consulting. She's found her space in the interaction of tech and law. Masheika, I'm going to let you speak about yourself since I am never very good at these introductions. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Masheika Allgood. I am an AI ethicist. We go by AllAI Consulting because it's cooler. I was a lawyer in a previous life, then moved into tech. Specifically looking for a space between tech and law. Found that space in the AI ethics domain. AllAI Consulting is an educational firm, largely, and we focus on educating non-techies, largely, about the impacts of AI, mainly Gen AI, generative AI, and we have put a lot of focus over the last couple of years on the environmental impacts. And so we have a Taps Run Dry is our platform for that work, which is accessible from our AllAI website, but we also have the Taps Run Dry website. So a lot of the papers that we'll talk about today, all of those run through Taps Run Dry. But yeah, just really trying to help people understand from a realistic standpoint what this technology means to us today and in our futures.
Thank you. I have to say, here in the Northeast, we have been living climate change. Last week, there were several days it went over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, about 38 Celsius. Today, it's about 74 degrees. It's been a little bit crazy. I was visiting a friend over the weekend. Their air conditioning couldn't keep up with the heat, which is crazy considering how advanced our cooling systems here are. I was talking to some colleagues in Germany about the heat wave in Europe, and they were telling me the news there is the heat in Europe with the flooding in Africa, and the contrasts are just kind of mind-blowing. And it just proves to me how much work we have to do. And Kate, what have you been up to while I've been, melting here?
Well, I was actually melting nearby you. I was in New Jersey over the weekend for a wedding, and actually, I was at my fiance's house and the power fully went out and the generator turned on. So because of the heat. So yeah, definitely got a little glimpse of that. And because it was the World Cup's going on, it was a fun flying experience. Everyone was tuning into all the games and the plane literally shook at moments. Everyone was like full exasperation at certain key moments of the game. And it was kind of fun to have people, their rivals, literally sitting inches from each other and unable to move away from each other. Very unique flight experience, I will say. And I got to read Masheika's paper. So I'm excited to dive into it.
Great. So Masheika recently published a two-part report about the effects of AI data centers on Georgia's water, along with Brandeis Marshall and Joy Victor. And we'll drop the link below, and I'll let Masheika speak more about it, and then we are prepared to have a lengthy discussion about this lengthy report. Go ahead.
Lengthy discussion about this lengthy report.
We are the right audience for this. I'm excited to talk about water.
So I guess I'll start with why we wrote this paper. So I had been doing this work for some time, and I had gotten frustrated at the theoretical nature of all the conversations around AI environmental impact. And I understood why we're speaking in theory, because I've had a hard time finding information myself, so I get it, right? But I felt like at some point, I'm telling people, as part of our work, we created this questions to ask when your city's building a data center, and it's this toolkit for communities to take to their local meetings and ask questions. So at some point, this information has to make it into the at least municipal government room in a way that people understand and can action on. And I just felt like there was a real gap between what we're saying in the ethics community and the environmental community and what is actually, getting through to people who are making these long-term decisions, right? And so when Doc Brandeis approached me about writing a paper about, environmental impacts in Georgia, I was like, this is the venue, right? Let's put it all in this one paper. And I approached it as, I don't want to write a book right now, but I want to write something substantial that is beneficial in a real way. And so the idea behind this was, let us explain, how this tech works, so that people understand all the buzzwords and whatnot, and what the limitations and reality of implementing those things are. And then what does this mean in a particular community? Atlanta has been by far the fastest data center build out over the last couple of years. They moved from not on the radar to number 2 largest data center market in the space of 5 years. They've done real work to get to where they are. They wanted to be here. But I don't think anyone, I know no one at the time understood what being here would mean. And so it was the right market to have this discussion in, because they've had, the buildup over a couple of years, so we can see some of the impacts and we can see some of the gaps. And then I was able to find a lot of information about their wastewater planning process, which was really helpful in actually identifying, how do you as a municipal leader prepare your city, county, state for this kind of influx. So it was a good test bed, a good place for a case study, and it was something that I was already really, I felt there was a need for, and so it just kind of, it ticked all the boxes.
I feel like one of the things the report gave me is it grounded all these different things I've learned about the trade-offs of AI. You have the electricity versus water trade-off. You have the different types of cooling systems. You have different types of literally water in an area, from groundwater, which Georgia doesn't have as much, versus streams and inflows. And I feel like it was almost placing all this knowledge in a context that's kind of cementing it for me. And I'm curious, I know that from you gave a lengthy post about this paper on your LinkedIn, and you kind of said that you're hoping to get this in the hands of officials. And I'm curious how you're planning on going about that, helping government officials be able to use this resource of knowledge to kind of cement some plans going forward for Georgia.
So that was the beauty of partnering with DataAdX. Dr. Brandeis' organization is they are in Georgia, and they have connections with the types of people who need to understand this information. So that's where their influence is. They have a whole process lined up for how they were going to market and send this information out to people within their sphere of influence. I love Georgia, but I am clearly in California now, very, very far away. And my network is a bit different. And so the DataAdX team they basically took this report and kind of massaged it to make it more, user-friendly for people who don't read a 60-page technical paper. And that's what they were sending out to governmental folks. Whereas my network is folks like you who are willing to dive in, some very enthusiastically so, to the technical details. And so I released, the academic version on my page on my site. And I've been targeting a lot of my international audience and audience outside of Georgia, because I think there's a significant gap between the reality of hosting a data center that we are seeing in the States, because we've had them, and the marketing that's being sold to a lot of different countries in South America and Europe that don't have the history of them. Mexico has had some of them for a long enough time to have their own experiences, and the marketing is no longer working. I think Uruguay also has had quite a few, Brazil. So South Central America has had kind of that awakening, but Europe, this is all brand new. And so when I tell them these things, they're shocked. And I want to make sure that they had some kind of regulatory understanding, because that's what's important in Europe, is can we make the laws protect us before we build the thing? And well, the US is a bit different. Build it as far as you can until someone creates a law to make you scale back. So.
Yeah. And on that note, I was just going to say, could you also tell people who may be listening about the regulatory landscape in Georgia? From my understanding, there isn't one, and it wasn't, data centers weren't included in regulation of water use in Georgia. But maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
So I'm not going to say there isn't a regulatory landscape in Georgia specifically. There is no regulatory landscape around AI or data centers in the US. That is a general issue. It is not Georgia specific. It is a general issue. We have not built real regulations around these data centers, which is why you see people, out in numbers protesting, because like, what the hell is happening in my backyard? And I'm not even getting noticed because I'm more than 1,000 feet away from where it's being built. Like, it's insane how much people don't know. And it's because we don't have rules across the US. The thing that was beneficial about Georgia's regulatory system when it came to this specific paper is they worked very hard to regulate water. Water is a fraught area all across the U.S. Regulation is a hodgepodge. We've got water management districts that are different than our county water, that are different than, the state environmental. So it's the way that we regulate water is non-logical. Let's just say, there's a professor out here who wrote a paper that I read several years ago on the history of water regulation in the U.S. And it basically was, ranchers and farmers need a certain amount of water, so they became the people who controlled water regulation. So these water management districts have these archaic rules about you having to own property to actually sit in a on a water management district board or in leadership. Those rules still exist. All of this is from way back in the day when the people who were using the most water, the farmers and the ranchers, needed control of the water. And we've never wrestled that from them. And so that's why it's such a weird area of regulation in the US. But the state of Georgia has, I think it was 2018, they did their first state water plan. They had a big law, it was a whole big thing to pass their first state water plan. And as part of that, the idea was to make a comprehensive planning for the state. So there's the local level has to go into the regional level has to work together and then create the state level. So they've created this process that they go through over years, right? Where they are taking inputs from the local level into the regional level. Regional makes its plan, and then those regional plans come together, and then they create a state plan. And there's a lot of back and forth in between. But the idea is that they realized the hodgepodge wasn't working. And so they wanted to create a streamlined process to make sure they look at this regularly and that it includes, local level input, and it's not just state down. So they're actually pretty advanced, I would say, when it comes to water regulation. But data centers are straining everyone's systems in ways that we just didn't understand.
I believe there's a similar effort in the Great Lakes region. I'm not sure if it's exactly the same, but there certainly is an attempt to gain back the power over water. It's as much for the drinking water as it is for the preservation of nature. But you probably know more about that than I do. But you mentioned international presence, and I was at the UN Open Source Conference 2 weeks ago. And there was a whole day dedicated to AI, open source AI. And something that blew my mind was that there were all of these organizations, governments, non-governments, any size you can think of. I'm talking about the development of AI data centers in countries that it never would have occurred to me would be developing data centers. And not a single person mentioned sustainability. Tomorrow there is an AI for Good summit in Geneva, which is kind of the continuation of this. And some of the people that we all know and talk to about sustainability are going to be there. So I'm kind of hoping they bring this information forward tomorrow. We can even ping some of them and say, hey, why don't you share this paper with the Minister of Technology in Morocco, who keeps talking about building her new data center. And maybe she can think about the impact it will have on the environment in Morocco. But it really just shocks me how there's this push toward AI. And I kept wanting to go up to these very impressive ministers and say, why? What are you doing? and I don't have the background about water. And I do wonder what we in the world can do to push this on an international level as well. Or what you're doing, what we can do to help you.
So I will say that the reason why I chose water. So I'm an AI ethicist. Like my range is all things AI, all impacts of AI, right? So I started out with everyone else, like the use cases, right? And what's the issues with the application? And you hear a lot of people talking about moratoriums and, oh, we need to slow it down. But I was like, you kind of need to find an area that's undeniable, right? I can argue that, it's not the tool, it's the person who uses the tool. Like I'm an American. I've heard that argument so many times around guns. It is sickening, right? So like they just shifted it to AI. Oh, the AI is not the problem. And I didn't want to go through that again. So I was like, what is an arena that is undeniable? Like, where is this technology causing issues that go beyond, personal responsibility? And when I first heard, it was a couple years ago, I think it was the president or the CEO of Microsoft slipped that they had used 20% of a city's aquifer to train ChatGPT. I said, what? Like, this is possible? You can do this? And you can take a fifth of a city's long-term water storage for your own individual purposes? Nah, that can't be right. And that's what set me down this path. And when I started looking into it, I was like, well, who's going to argue water? Like, who is going to stand up and legitimately argue, we don't need water? Screw your drinking. I want AI. Like, it's such an imbalanced mental state to try to say, unbalanced, to try to say that, like, this technology is more important than being able to drink water, right? And so I was like, because we knew that the technology was addressing or impacting fundamental parts of society, but society is existential for us. So it's very hard to get people to like really get up in arms about something that's destroying our society. We just move further inwards. Like if society is crazy, we create a bubble and we just stay within our bubble, right? And so, Europe understood the importance of that. China understood the importance of that. And they started creating these large scale AI regulations around, the application level impacts, right? What's destroying society? Because society matters in their communities, in their cultures, right? But that wasn't going to do it for Americans. we'll just make our society smaller, right? But what we can't do is not drink water. And so, like, if you understand your culture, then you understand the pain points. And at the end of the day, people want to live, and they want their children and their nieces and their nephews to be able to live. And when you start talking about contaminants getting into the water that people haven't even recognized are problems that they're not testing for and they're not treating for, and this could do something to you as you age, as you grow, then alarm bells go off in a way that even Americans can't ignore. So, like, the way that I've been addressing this, or why I chose water, is because it's an undeniable issue. Like, there is only so much of it on the planet. Societies do not exist without it. And so you can ignore it at your peril, but it's going to be hard to be a politician who, like, ignored this when your cities start running out of water. That's a really tough place to be. What politicians, they may seem very thick-skinned, but they're making trade-offs as well. right? And the trade-off of survivability versus cool tech progress does not go well in their favor. So like you have to give people a reason to say no that is not political and that is deeply undeniable. And then you'll see a little bit more courage and people standing up and doing things that need to be done. At least that's what I believe. We'll see how right I am over time, but that was the path that I decided to take.
I think it's incredibly alarming, especially when, for me, I think conceptualizing AI data centers use water. For someone who is not as in touch with where my water comes from, I wasn't really able to ground that. But through researching more and reading your paper, you realize they're literally plugging into the municipal tap. And that's when you start realizing that I think you mentioned in your report, it was like every day a data center was using the equivalent of 87 people worth of water, but then it only returns 20% of that water as blowdown, while like the average person returns like 80% of their water. So it's just exhausting a resource that true humans would otherwise be taking. And that really grounds and rings the alarm bells. The other thing that was really kind of funny to me and reading the paper was how the data centers are more picky about their water than us humans are. I feel like there were pages and pages on how the data center needs to treat their water like 10 times more than we treat our water. And it was crazy to think that we are prioritizing making water safer for data centers than we are for people. And that also shocked me a bit.
Yeah, it turns out technology isn't as hardy as humans. Who knew?
No, that part really spoke to me too. I think that's something that I've had trouble getting across to people that I speak to is it's hard for people to understand. I guess most people aren't physicists. Why the water doesn't just go back into the environment? That evaporation is not the same thing as flushing a toilet. And I'm not sure why that's such a difficult concept because most of us, and maybe I'm thinking too highly of the people I talk to, but that evaporation is not the same thing, even though, there's, a finite amount of water in the Earth's atmosphere that when it evaporates, it doesn't automatically go back into groundwater. I'm not sure why that concept is difficult. Maybe you've encountered that, Masheika, and can help me explain it to people better.
Yeah, it's just the belief that what goes up will come down, right? And so when I first started doing, talking about water, people would consistently hammer me on, oh, but evaporated water always comes back to the earth. I was like, yeah, but where? Like, no water is ever lost to the planet, but it's lost to you. So do I really care if my data center is watering a community in East Africa? Is that going to benefit me like today? So when if all of our water it's being evaporated in California and it's making it over to, Canada. Well, bully for Canada, but my community has no water. So I think it's the concept that no, it isn't lost, but it's lost to you, is how I've kind of had to frame it. Like, we once again, we like to talk about things in theory and grandness, but you have to refine your thoughts to the reality of the situation you're in. I am very happy to provide water to places that have less water, but not at the expense of my place having less water, right? So it's not like we're being altruistic and we're, wanting to give this water to other people because we have so much more. We have finite water ourselves. And so when you let that water go halfway across the globe, that water is not necessarily coming back from halfway across the globe, right? And not in a way that's going to go into your aquifer over the hundreds of years it took for it to get there in the first place. So I get the concept of water is not lost, but we have to get out of these snippet thinking. I think we're so conditioned to see everything as a pithy little saying or a short video that we're losing the concept of, thinking deeply about a subject. And just a little bit of thinking says, well, yeah, the water's not lost, but the water that goes up doesn't necessarily come right back down. And if it doesn't come right back down, then that aquifer is not getting refilled. So the tech companies have done a lot to kind of, boost this thinking as well, because they always talk about, oh, our replenishment, we're putting in more water than we're taking out, but they're not putting that water back in the places where they're taking it out. So they're doing the same kind of magical thinking. And since they won't speak about it critically, and the people who listen to them are just spouting what they're spouting, then you get this loop of non-critical thinking that puts out this perception in the world that's not grounded in reality.
I think it's the same with a lot of the buzzwords we've heard, the concept of closed loop systems, as we saw in your report. There are many different kinds of closed loop systems. And I just a few months ago, I work in standards for sustainability, or digital sustainability, I should say. Somebody contacted me and said, will you write a guideline that says that data centers have to have closed loop systems? And I just said no. And I explained why. And I said, it's going to change. I don't even know what the term means in terms of, such a finite definition. It changes every day. And I was so pleased to see your detailed description and definitions of closed loop systems, even though it is likely that these things will change again within a few months.
Oh, no,
So
they'll
they-
definitely change. Yeah, so I'd written a paper specifically because that got on my nerves so bad. And it's called Closed Loop Ain't Closed. Because this concept of, it's an ever circulating loop. I was like, well, how does it cool down? And no one had an answer. They're just like, oh, it pulls the heat and then it gets cold and then it pulls the heat. I was like, okay, so where does that heat go? Crickets. Because that's an open loop, right? And nobody wants to talk about the open loop. So once again, this is a marketing thing. So the tech companies realized they were getting hammered on evaporative cooling. And they said, no, our loops are closed. And only spoke about the closed loop, to the detriment of anyone who really wants to understand, the water use. And so people would hammer me once again on my LinkedIn and say, well, they should just use closed loops. And I was like, I am Google. Like, Google is the most advanced, quote unquote, responsible. I can't even say quote unquote. They are the most responsible water user out of the big tech companies. I want to say quote unquote because they still suck, but they all suck, and they suck a little less, right? This is the most responsible we get, and they are evaporating 80% of the water they use. So when you just say just use closed loop, it's because you fundamentally don't understand that closed loop ain't closed, right? But to your point of the tech changing and things changing within, a very short period of time. So I posted this article last week, like Wednesday or Tuesday. And then Friday, someone on my LinkedIn made a post about a water issue in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and talking about closed loop again. Meta has a facility they're building there. And as part of that, this first facility is supposed to use closed loop cooling, right? And so there's a system which I had not heard of and so have not written about in my paper. It's called, fill and flush. And it's basically you build the system and you get all kind of stuff in it as you're putting the pipes together or whatever. So then you fill the system with water and you flush all of that out. And then you can add this, the pure or the quality water that you created, or your glycol substitute or whatever you want to do. But you have to basically prime the system by flushing out all the bad stuff with your purified water. So you pump it full of purified water, fill it, and then you flush all of that out, and it drags all the sediment and everything that happened during the build process. So in Cheyenne, Meta does this process. The people who are building the facility do this process. And through that process, there is some sort of, they got a contaminant in the water.
I was about to ask.
Yeah, Cupia viridis gilardi. I don't know the name, but it's a rare type of bacteria. It's naturally found in the environment, but in small numbers, right? But because you need so much water for these systems, it came out into the wastewater in very high concentrations. And because they don't test for this, because it's naturally occurring, it made it through back into the source system because even when it went to wastewater, it wasn't treated because you don't usually treat naturally occurring things. But when it's at this concentration, now they're concerned that there may be issues for people with who are immunocompromised. Now, Cheyenne, Wyoming, their wastewater reclamation system goes into watering the grass and those kinds of uses, right? So there is some concern, but it didn't go directly into the drinking water. Our paper in Georgia, one of the parts you may have noticed is that where they take their drinking water and where they discharge their wastewater, they're not necessarily far apart. So things that come out of wastewater treatment can go directly back into drinking water. They have a whole system where they're trying to split these further apart, but it's a very small water system that they're dealing with. So this is the limitations of that system. So part of the paper I talk about is when you're doing data center, like the cooling tower blowdown, you super concentrate things. But this was a whole different area. Like before you even get the facility up and running, just the wastewater from, cleaning out the closed loop system poses issues to your wastewater treatment. So it's been less than a week and my paper has already needs an update for this new system that we hadn't really considered. So we don't know enough about these facilities and we've built them at scale all around the country without having an understanding, and we're learning on the fly. And as a techie, I understand we do that. We build and iterate, but you can't do that with lives. These are people's actual lives, but that's how we're taking our tech processes and using them in an infrastructure realm where this is a risk adverse process, right? And we're inserting a high risk process into a risk averse system. And it's not going to pay off for us. It's not paying off for us. It's deeply problematic, and grateful that this happened to work out to where they have a good system to where they're not immediately reusing that water as drinking water. But these are the kinds of questions you need to ask as a municipal leader when you're thinking of bringing on these kinds of facilities.
There's a whole section that you have in your report. That's the chemicals section. I'm sure it has a different name, but I remember there was a chemical in there, and you've been through every chemical, and you said who regulated it. So is it regulated by the EPA, the FDA, some independent organization, or none? And that I did not realize was possible for a data center to use a coolant that's a chemical that has no regulation. And so I'm curious how that is possible and allowed to just inject a chemical that we don't know the side effects of.
If you find out, you tell me. That was part of the shock and awe of creating this paper. I learned things that were pretty horrifying, that we don't have a process for determining, there's no one who a data center facility operator has to give a list to of the chemicals that they plan to use on site. That is not a thing you do during the planning process. There's no regulatory requirement for you to list out the chemicals that you're going to use. So wastewater treatment doesn't have a chemical list. So how can they say if they're going to be able to filter these things? And then as far as the city is concerned, if I want to have 500,000 gallons of motor oil to run my closed loop system, there's no real regulation to tell me I can't. There may be ancillary regulations in some cities around how you can store and how much you can keep of certain things, but we haven't seen a comprehensive regulatory push towards managing these things in scale. Because you have to think a lot of these chemicals are not really heavily used. They're becoming heavily used because of data centers. So this is not it's an oversight, but it's an oversight in a way that no one really understood that this was going to be a thing, right? Some of these new closed loop are using bespoke chemicals, right? Because it's all R&D. So they're testing a brand new kind of chemical. Well, how can it be regulated if it's still being tested? Like, when I was going through to try to figure out that chemical list, oh my God, the amount of hours to find the information that I actually was able to find. Some of these have reports that are, the only thing in the report is their test on animals. And they're like, this is what we got through animal testing, and more testing needs to be done. Like, these haven't even been fully tested or observed in human environments. Like, these are not, we don't use these chemicals in this way for any other application. And so the thing in the US, and what I alluded to earlier, is you push as far as you can go because the regulation doesn't exist. And then once there's a problem, people create regulations. And so I don't think anyone knew, well, I know no one knew that these kind of chemicals would be used at this scale. And so it just never occurred to anyone to regulate them in this way.
It reminds me in some ways of the differences in healthcare in the US and Europe, and also the pharmaceutical industry, or I should say the supplement industry. The supplement industry in the US is not at all regulated, and yet here we are with people taking supplements in so many ways that we just have no idea what people are ingesting and if they're helpful or harmful. But with healthcare, in particular, I'm thinking about the vaccine schedules that differ between the US and Europe. The way I've heard it explained is that in Europe, the approach is that there's a more robust healthcare system in place. So there's more preventative medicine and more rescue medicine available. So some of the vaccines that are required by the American Pediatric Association are in place here as more of a safety network, because that safety network is not necessary in some other countries. So, like you were saying, you push it as far as it will go in the US until there's a regulation. It's more of a, let's see how far we can take things and then rescue people, as opposed to keeping people safe in the first place.
Yeah, we don't prevent here. It's not really, because preventative is like slowing down, and everything must happen at speed, right? I remember when I was first getting into this AI ethics work, and it was a group of us at NVIDIA, the Black NVIDIA Network. We're trying to like raise these issues internally and figure out what we want to do around ethics. We went to the head of, I think it was either applied research or theoretical research. They had two different people, and I think it was the one was like, oh, please let me know more about this, and the other one was like, I don't care what you do, just don't slow us down. I don't want any rules to slow us down. And when we actually took our hard fought, like year-long to prepare presentation that we had people from all over the country and Europe come in to actually present it to Jensen. When we actually presented that to Jensen, his thing was the regulations will figure it out. And basically nothing needed to be done until then, because he was the adult and he was going to handle any concerns that may be had. It was illuminating in all the wrong ways, but that's the mentality in tech, is we can do whatever we want until the rules tell us no. And that's okay when you're building software to some degree. Not to all degrees, but to some degree, right? Because it is a risky environment. Like, you're meant to be out here doing things on the cutting edge. But the difference between this AI buildup and all the other ones that preceded it is the incorporation of infrastructure,
Yeah.
in a real and abiding way. Like, every time we boomed and bust out here in California, it only hurt us and people who would spend their money on us. But this is the first time that we have basically captured infrastructure across the country and the world and brought it into our boom and bust system. And that is a fundamentally different level of responsibility that you can't go into with some wild west thinking. Infrastructure is a 30-year plan out process. Now you're saying get it done in 3 years. People are going to have gaps. You're going to miss things, and that's intentional. But this is not something you can iterate on. You can't just fix the code and the water will return. Like, there's a level of responsibility that is required for infrastructure that we just cannot replace with innovative thinking. And I think that's where where we've gotten ourselves into some real trouble. And that's why I focused very heavily on, you know, I understand we have to do what we have to do for the facilities that we have, but we got to stop the bleeding here and across the globe. You gotta stop the bleeding, and then we gotta figure out how to manage what we've already broken. But we can't keep building these facilities when we see that we're not prepared to have them.
So are there any industries or infrastructures or models of infrastructure that we can look to for guidance? Or is this just unprecedented?
It's not that it's unprecedented, it's just flat out irresponsible. Like, it's not like we haven't built infrastructure in this country before. Like, we built railroads all the way across the country. The U.S. is massive. If you've ever spent any time traveling around Europe, you're like, oh, that was a state. You mean that was a whole country? Like, I'm from Florida. You can drive 9 hours top to bottom in the same state. Like, we're a massive undertaking, and we built infrastructure, roads, water networks, power lines. We built all this infrastructure over decades and generations. But that's the difference. We built it over decades and generations because we understood infrastructure takes time. Whereas with tech, everything has to be built in 5 years. Like, and that's the difference. Like, no one else has been so abjectly irresponsible with building infrastructure. And that's why this is fundamentally different. It's not that we don't know how to build a building. It's not that the tech couldn't catch up and make these data centers less problematic for society or for the environments that they're in. It's just they don't want to wait. They're too impatient to allow the tech to get to a point where it should scale. All of this should still be R&D because it is R&D. It should be run out of universities and think tanks and select like offshoot X prize projects, right? But we're building it as if it's settled infrastructure that we know all the ins and outs of, and we can put it anywhere in the world. So that's the difference. It's the impatience. It's moving before we're ready, and then telling people it'll be fine when we have absolutely no basis to say that. So I don't think we have to look to industry to teach us how to do this. I think we just need to do it like we know how to do it and stop with this manufactured rush. Like, it doesn't have to be at this speed to get to where we need to get.
I think another thing that I just wanted to also discuss is we talked about how there's not regulation at the federal level, and we're working on it at the state level, but it's also data disclosure is not required. And when it is given, it's given in these vague, large lump sum numbers. So you talk about Google disclosing like annual water usage, or it's not always localized. And there was another bit of research or research paper that we discussed in episode 141 about a group from the University of Alabama and York University who developed a hydrological stress index. And it reminded me a lot of the work you're doing, Masheika, because we have to talk about the use of the water in the context of the local geography. And I was curious if you've looked at HSI or the hydrological stress index and you feel like a formula like that could be impactful for establishing some sense of which type of data center to create. I mean, your paper talks about how the trade-offs between energy usage and water usage and different jurisdictions and geographies might choose different choices there based on kind of how much water is available.
So I think it's always helpful to have more information. And it's always helpful to have some sort of objective measure. So no, I think that HSI is very beneficial. But I think I am less concerned with a federal law of regulation for all of this, because the federal government doesn't build data centers. The state doesn't build data centers. Communities build data centers. That's cities, counties, regions build data centers, right? Not even regions, cities and counties in the U.S. build data centers. In other countries, it may be different, but in the U.S., it is at the local level. So for me, getting out that HSI, along with an understanding of, this is how water is used by data centers to kind of combat what they're getting from the marketing arm of the people who are trying to develop these facilities, I think puts a local leader in a position to have a real conversation about what this will cost and if this is going to end up paying out in a real way. I just, since this is local level management, then I think we take a local level approach, and that's been my focus. Although I will say Utah taught me something different. Utah said, no. You want to step in at the state level? Okay, we're going to make this a state level issue. And threw out the head of the Senate because he jumped into a local level permitting issue and was on the wrong side of it, and tried to push the community to do something that was clearly against their interest. And not only did they push back at the community level, they pushed back at the state level and got him deposed, right? So I think that kind of sent a shiver up the spine of politicians all around the country, being that Utah is a deeply red state, and we keep trying to say water is not political and you can ignore that at your peril. But yeah, like people want to protect where they're from. So I think giving them information that helps them ground what they're being told with the reality of their current situation is always going to be beneficial. So there are a couple different tools that are out. Like my paper will give you a deep and abiding understanding of all of like the technical components you need to go into a conversation and really feel empowered and informed, right? And then there's these, indices that are being created that help you understand, okay, in my community, this is what water looks like. And so understanding how water is used and what our water looks like, can we afford to have this kind of facility? And if we can, in what way, right? Because the flip side of the water stress index is understanding your wastewater treatment capacity, right? Do you have enough capacity in terms of volume? And then do you have the right technology that can manage the types of chemicals that are coming through, right? And so you have to have both sides of that addressed. So I think we're starting to get, I found a paper that had like a global understanding of the type of technology each different wastewater treatment plant had, but it was really hard to parse. And I'm hoping somebody will put an overlay on it that makes it easier for people to get to, because I tried to use it, but it was all longitude and latitude. And so there was and Georgia's a really weirdly shaped state, so there was no way to put a boundary around it in order to kind of so I'm hoping that someone clusters it into states level so that you can actually look, because they had every wastewater treatment facility on the planet, and they had done certain analysis of what it was able to treat. And I thought that was really valuable, and I really wanted to use it in the paper, but I couldn't find a way to get a realistic understanding of which of these facilities are in Georgia. So I couldn't use it, but we're starting to get these kinds of things that'll tell us on both sides, do we have enough water capacity for drinking and supporting these facilities? Do we have enough wastewater capacity to handle the volume and the chemical mix? And if we don't, are there mitigations we can put in place to get to where we need to be? And I will say, unsolicited, if a data center company says they're going to build a facility to support their water or their wastewater needs, make them build it first. Before you build your data center, build our water treatment plant. Because what we found is they say they'll build it, Memphis, XAI, and then say business conditions have changed. And just shut down the project. And now you're stuck because wastewater has to be treated, right? You can't just say, oh, well, now you still have to handle it through the municipal, right? You're always the fallback as a local entity. So just unsolicited, any governmental folks who are paying attention, anything that a facility says they're going to build to support that facility, require them to build it before they're allowed to build a facility. Otherwise, you run the risk of them not building it at all.
Good advice. I feel like where I live, I think where both Kate and I live, we're at risk of being built on. But you've, in previous talks, you've said that the whole country is basically marked to be data centers. I live near the Meadowlands, which is, basically a big swamp, but it's been built up before, and it probably will be built up again. And I see no reason why they shouldn't look to that, which has lots of water. to be a data center. So great advice for how to fight back.
Yeah, I live in Sunnyvale, and the right behind me, we've got a data center cluster. It has, let's see, 73 data centers in a 9 square mile area. And we've got 11 data centers in a 0.2 square mile area, like one particular neighborhood. And in that cluster, there was one Amazon Data Services facility that deployed their 45 backup generators for 395 hours, 394 hours in one calendar year. And then there's a second facility in that same cluster that used their 14 diesel backup generators for 241 hours the next year. And that's the only two that we have information on out of the 11. So like, this is right up the street from my house. Like, there are people who live in that community and they're doing hundreds of hours of data center diesel generator runs. And we're in California, which is like the most environmentally protected state in the country. But we have this. So if we haven't figured it out and this is what we do, then everyone else needs to be very on point with, we need to get the rules in place before we do the building. Slow them down. You got to do it.
I was introduced to you, Masheika, at Green IO, which in New York a few months back, which you opened up, and you kind of set the tone for the conference. And you ended your talk by asking, who is this for? And just kind of asking people to think about, who are these AI data centers for and who are they benefiting? And I think that question is a powerful one to ask yourself every day. If you're losing some of your steam around staying informed and involved, just asking yourself, who is this really for? And I thought that was a powerful message to kind of kick off that event and to remind folks of.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you so much, Masheika. That was really, really interesting. I really encourage everybody to read the paper or at least give it a skim. I think most of the people who listen to this podcast are the types of people who will read it in depth. That's it for this week's TWiGS. We've covered a paper that Masheika Allgood and her colleagues put out about the effects of data centers on water, in particular in Georgia. It's a detailed case study. Thanks for joining, and thanks to Masheika and Kate for the great discussion. If you want to keep exploring, check the links we mentioned in the show notes, and you can visit podcast.greensoftware.foundation to listen to more episodes of Environmental Variables. See you all in the next episode. Bye for now.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Just a reminder to follow Environment Variables on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do leave a rating and review if you like what we're doing. It helps other people discover the show. And of course, we'd love to have more listeners. To find out more about the Green Software Foundation, please visit greensoftware.foundation. That's greensoftware.foundation in any browser. Thanks again, and see you in the next episode.